November 1944. The Vosges Mountains, eastern France. A German general major stands in the ruins of what was once a French railway junction, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Through his Zeiss binoculars, he watches something that defies every calculation, every assessment his staff has made about American logistics. An unbroken line of freight cars stretches beyond the horizon, not dozens, but hundreds, moving with mechanical precision through countryside his own forces had methodically destroyed only months before. He lowers the binoculars slowly, and for the first time in his 30-year military career, he understands that Germany has not merely miscalculated American industrial capacity. They have failed to comprehend an entirely different philosophy of war. The German High Command had studied American methods with characteristic thoroughness. Their intelligence reports documented the vast production figures, the ships, the tanks, the aircraft rolling from factories that seemed to operate beyond the laws of resource scarcity that governed European warfare. But numbers on paper are abstractions. What unfolded across the shattered rail network of France in the autumn of 1944 was something their doctrine had no framework to process. The complete reimagining of military supply as an engineering problem to be solved with the same industrial creativity America applied to everything else. When the Wehrmacht planned their campaigns, they calculated logistics in terms of what their army could carry, what the land could provide, what could be extracted from conquered territories. Their supply trains were adequate for wars of movement across European distances, for armies that lived partially off the land, for soldiers accustomed to the lean rations of a nation that had known scarcity since 1914. The American approach seemed, to German eyes, almost incomprehensibly wasteful. Intelligence estimates suggested the Americans were supplying their forces with 3 times the tonnage per soldier that German forces required. This was dismissed as inefficiency, as the softness of a nation that had never known true hardship. They were catastrophically wrong. The German commanders expected that the destruction of France's rail infrastructure, the methodical work of years of occupation, and then the desperate demolitions of their retreat, would slow the American advance to a crawl. Every major bridge along the Loire, the Seine, the Meuse had been dropped into the rivers. Marshalling yards were cratered moonscapes. Tunnels were collapsed. Signal systems were reduced to tangled wire and shattered glass. The rail network that had taken France a century to build had been reduced to scrap metal and rubble in months. German staff officers calculated that it would take the Americans a year, perhaps longer, to restore even basic functionality. The advance would stall at the German border. Winter would come, and perhaps, in that pause, something might be negotiated. Instead, the Americans brought the railroad with them. The U.S. Army's military railway service arrived in France not as administrators of existing systems, but as builders of new ones. They came with portable bridges fabricated in Pittsburgh foundries, with prefabricated rail sections that could be laid at a mile per day, with diesel locomotives that required no coaling stations, no elaborate maintenance facilities, machines designed for the vast distances of American prairies, now deployed across the ruins of Europe. Within weeks of the Normandy breakout, American engineers were running trains through territory where German reports insisted no rail traffic was possible. A captured German logistics officer, interrogated in December 1944, provided testimony that revealed the psychological impact of witnessing American supply operations. We watched them bridge the Moselle in 3 days. The span our own engineers said could not be rebuilt before spring. They did not repair the French system. They built an American railroad on top of the rubble. Different gauge, different signals, different everything. As if France were simply empty land to be developed, like their Wild West. The scale was what broke German comprehension. By October 1944, the military railway service was operating over 2,000 route miles of track across France. They were moving 18,000 tons of supplies per day through networks that had moved perhaps a third of that at their wartime peak under German control. The trains ran with a regularity that seemed to mock the chaos of war itself, scheduled, timed, coordinated with a precision that suggested the combat front was merely an inconvenient detail in a larger industrial process. German commanders watched these supply columns with a growing sense of dread that transcended tactical concern. Each freight car represented not just material, but philosophy. The Americans were not supplying an army in the field. They were extending America itself across the ocean, laying down not just rails, but an entire system of abundance that made European calculations of scarcity irrelevant. The psychological transformation among German officers who witnessed these operations was profound and rarely discussed in official reports, but it emerges in letters, in post-war interviews, in the careful silences of men who had believed absolutely in their cause and found that belief corroding under the weight of observed reality. They had been taught that Americans were soft, that their mongrel democracy could never match the focused will of the Reich. But the railroad told a different story. Every freight car that rolled past German positions carried the same message, repeated in endless variation. Flour in quantities sufficient to bake fresh bread for 1 million men daily. Cigarettes by the millions, not the ersatz tobacco of German rations, but genuine American tobacco. Gasoline in volumes that German panzer commanders could only fantasize about. Spare parts for every vehicle, every weapon, every piece of equipment, as if the very concept of making do with limited resources was alien to American thinking. A German report from 7th Army Headquarters, dated November 12, 1944, noted with barely concealed despair, enemy supply trains pass within artillery range continuously. We have insufficient ammunition to interdict more than a fraction of this traffic. When we do achieve hits, the disruption is temporary. Damaged sections are bypassed or repaired within hours. The Americans appear to have unlimited materials for reconstruction. They waste steel on temporary expedients that we would reserve for permanent fortifications. The wastefulness itself became a weapon. German soldiers, hungry on reduced rations as their own supply lines collapsed under Allied air interdiction, watched American supply trains haul food in quantities that seemed to mock the very idea of military efficiency. Fresh eggs, canned fruit, coffee, real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute that German troops had endured since 1942. The excess was deliberate, calculated to sustain not just life but morale, to remind every American soldier that his nation's wealth reached across the ocean to provide not just necessities but comforts. The symbolic power of the railroad extended beyond its material function. For the French civilians emerging from years of occupation, the sight of American trains running through restored stations represented something more profound than logistics. These were not the cattle cars that had carried their neighbors east to death camps. These were not the military transports that had brought occupation forces. These were the engines of liberation running on tracks laid by men who worked with a casual competence that suggested rebuilding entire nations was simply what Americans did. The transformation in German strategic thinking emerged gradually through the autumn of 1944, visible in the increasingly desperate tone of headquarters assessments. Early reports had focused on tactical problems, how to cut supply lines, where to concentrate limited artillery to disrupt rail traffic. By December, the reports revealed a different concern, the recognition that they were not fighting an army, but an industrial system that had no European equivalent. A memorandum from Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters, captured after the war, contained this stark assessment. The American supply system represents not merely quantitative superiority, but a qualitative difference in warfare. We are attempting to fight an industrial process with military means. It is comparable to attacking a factory with cavalry. The Ardennes Offensive, the desperate winter counterattack that became the Battle of the Bulge, was conceived partly from this recognition. German planners knew they could not outlast American supply capacity in a sustained campaign. Their only hope was a lightning strike to seize the American supply dumps at Liège and Antwerp, to capture the fuel and food and ammunition that German industry could no longer produce in sufficient quantity. The plan revealed how completely German strategic thinking had been shaped by the railroad. They would steal American abundance because they could no longer match it. The offensive failed, crushed under the weight of American material superiority and the resilience of the very supply system it sought to disrupt. Within days of the German breakthrough, the military railway service was rerouting supplies around the Bulge, maintaining delivery schedules with minimal disruption. The Germans captured some supply dumps in their initial advance and found what their intelligence had reported, but their soldiers had not truly believed. Warehouses stacked to the ceiling with rations, fuel depots with enough gasoline to supply a panzer army for months, ammunition stocks that would have sustained German forces for years. German soldiers in the Ardennes found themselves fighting while eating captured American rations that were better than anything they had tasted since the war began. The irony was not lost on them. They were being sustained by the enemy's surplus while their own supply system collapsed. By January 1945, as the Ardennes Offensive ground to its inevitable defeat, the psychological impact of the American supply system had become as significant as its material effect. German soldiers surrendering in increasing numbers spoke not of military defeat, but of futility. How do you fight an enemy who can afford to waste more than you can afford to use? How do you maintain belief in final victory when the enemy supply trains run with the regularity of peacetime commerce, while your own forces scrounge for fuel and ammunition? The railroad became the symbol of everything the Reich had promised and failed to deliver. Nazi ideology had spoken of discipline overcoming decadence, of German efficiency defeating democratic chaos, of spiritual will triumphing over materialist excess. But the trains rolling through France told a different story. That abundance was not weakness, that industrial capacity was not mere materialism, but the foundation of freedom, that a democracy that could feed its army fresh bread at the front had already won the argument about which system better served human dignity. In the end, the American railroad across France represented something the German commanders had not anticipated and could not counter: the projection of an entire civilization's values through infrastructure. Every train that rolled toward the front carried not just supplies, but proof that democracy could out-organize dictatorship, that free labor could outproduce slave labor, that a nation built on individual liberty could, when necessary, coordinate collective action on a scale that made authoritarian efficiency look primitive by comparison. The ruined stations rebuilt, the bridges replaced, the trains running on schedule through countryside still scarred by war. These were not merely logistical achievements. They were philosophical statements delivered in steel and steam, arguments made with freight cars and reconstructed track, proof that the American approach to war was fundamentally different not because Americans were better soldiers, but because they came from a society organized around different principles. May 1945. A German railway engineer, conscripted into military service, sits in a prisoner compound near Reims and watches American supply trains still running with metronomic precision, still delivering abundance to armies that no longer face serious opposition. He had spent his career building Germany's rail network, had taken pride in the efficiency of German systems, in the precision of German engineering. Now he watches American trains running on temporary tracks, powered by locomotives designed for utility rather than elegance, moving supplies in quantities that make a mockery of German calculations. And he understands, perhaps more clearly than the generals ever did, that Germany lost this war the moment they failed to comprehend that America's strength was never in superior will or better soldiers, but in a system that assumed abundance was possible, that waste was affordable, that 1 million men could be fed and supplied across an ocean because Americans had built a civilization where such things were simply engineering problems to be solved. The train whistle echoes across the compound, and in that sound is the entire story of the war, not the thunder of artillery or the roar of aircraft, but the steady, unstoppable rhythm of trains carrying more than any army needed, more than any nation should be able to provide, more than should be possible, arriving on schedule, always on schedule, as inevitable and implacable as the future itself.